Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning, Laws and Democracy in Education, the State Budget Process, and K-12 Funding. My name is Sarah Jimenez, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications here at the California Budget and Policy Center. We are grateful for our many supporters who help make our work possible, and the work of improving public policies that affect the economic and social well-being of Californians with low and middle incomes. And today we give special thanks to the Sobrato Family Foundation and the Stewart Foundation for helping lift up important issues for our K-12 students. A couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started. Our webinar will be recorded and posted to the Budget Center's website. You can see that on your screen right now. It's www.calbudgetcenter.org. If you have questions, and we hope you do have many questions throughout, you can answer them via the chat box function, which is should be on your right-hand side. Just type in your questions and we will get to as many as possible at the end of our presentation. And if we don't get to some of those questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll have some email addresses at the end of the presentation where you can certainly follow up with us if we are unable to answer your questions or you have pretty detailed questions that are not covered in our presentation. And also a reminder that we have a range of resources available on our website, well beyond K-12 education, but including K-12 education. So please do visit our website and also follow us on Twitter. We're at Cal Budget Center on Twitter. And now moving on to today's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. First, we'll be hearing from Jonathan Kaplan, our Senior Policy Analyst here at the California Budget and Policy Center. Then we'll hear from Martha, the Lobbyist with Zaragoza, Diaz and Associates. And finally, we'll hear from Lizzette Barrios-Gracian, a teacher at Anaheim High School. And now I will turn it over to our first speaker, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Appreciate it. I'm looking forward today to talking to you about the state budget process and K-12 school funding, and also from hearing from Martha and Lizzette at the end of the after my presentation today. So first, let me explain to you some goals of my presentation today. I'm hoping to explain to you why it is that the state budget matters for schools, to increase your understanding of the state budget process by reviewing the key players in the budget process as well as a timeline in that budget process, all with the goal of it providing information to help improve your engagement in the state budget process moving forward. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about why it is that the state budget matters for schools, why it is that you might care about the state budget if you're out there and looking at how K-12 schools are funded. To answer that question, I think it's important to consider where K-12 school funding actually comes from. And to answer that question, let's take a look at a pie chart. As you can see from this pie chart, the majority of K-12 education funding comes from the state. As shown in the blue pie slices on the pie chart, roughly 60% of K-12 school district and county office of education funding comes from state revenues. About half of school dollars comes from state aid for general purposes. That's the largest blue pie slice on the chart. And the state provides roughly 10% of funding for what's so-called other state revenue that's earmarked for very specific purposes, for example, for special education and child nutrition programs. Less than 2% of funding from the state comes from the California State Lottery, as represented by the smallest blue pie slice at the bottom left portion of the chart. Now, looking at the rest of school funding aside from state sources, about a quarter of dollars that arrive at schools and county office doors come from the local property taxes collected at the local level. And less than 10% of funding comes from either the federal government or from other local sources such as parcel taxes or contributions from things like local education foundations. Now, a lot of attention is paid to the local control funding formula, and there's a good reason for that. This next pie chart will show where those LCFF dollars come from. This same pie chart, as reflected previously, shows that the local control funding formula comes from two sources: the state and local property tax dollars. And when we look at LCFF dollars alone, we see that more than 2/3 of LCFF dollars comes from the state. So here we have two main reasons why it is that the state budget matters so much for schools. First, the majority of K-12 education funding comes from the state. And second, more than 2/3 of funding for the LCFF comes from the state. So if it's coming from the state, one question I think is important as well to answer is, where does state funding for K-12 schools come from? Well, the vast majority, in fact, nearly all of state funding for K-12 education funding comes from something called the state's general fund. While there are small pots of dollars outside of the state general fund that provide funding for schools, the most important factor in determining the funds that go to K-12 schools each year is the state's general fund. So, what is the state's general fund? Let's take a look at another pie chart. The general fund is the part of the state budget the legislature has the greatest authority over, and it has the greatest authority to make decisions about. And when we look at how the state spends its state general fund dollars, we see that K-12 education receives the largest share of funding from the state budget. Slightly less than 40% of general fund spending each year, as shown in the blue pie slice on this chart. And in most years, the size of the state general fund, or the overall size of this pie chart, correlates to the amount of the money that the state spends on schools each year. If the amount of the general fund dollars increases in an annual basis, the pie here gets larger, and the amount that the state spends on schools tends to grow. On the other hand, if the amount of general fund dollars shrinks, the pie shrinks as well, and the amount of funding that is available to spend on schools generally falls. Now, this is how the state spends the state's general fund, but where does state general fund dollars come from? Another pie chart I'll be showing to you tells you why it is that annual state revenues matter a great deal for education funding, because the size of that general fund determines the size how much school districts actually receive. And when we look at how the state's general fund gets its dollars, we see that nearly all of state general fund dollars come from three sources. The personal income tax, which represented by the blue pie slice on this chart, is roughly 70% of state general fund revenues. About 20% comes from the sales tax, that's represented by the orange pie slice on the chart, and roughly 10% comes from the corporate income tax, which is the yellow pie slice on the chart. So to review for some key reasons why it is that the state budget matters so much for schools. First, the majority of K-12 school funding comes from the state's general fund. Second, because 2/3 of this local control funding formula comes from the state, which points to why it is that the state budget and the size of the state revenues in this pie chart matter so much for schools. So now that I've talked to you a little bit about why the state budget matters for schools, let's look at actually what the state budget is and the state budget process. Another reason that the state budget matters so much for schools is that the legislature has wide authority to decide how general fund dollars for K-12 schools are spent annually, which is why understanding the state budget process is key for shaping those decisions. Now, there are several ways to shape public policies at the state level in California, and this graphic shows them. First, people can vote and vote on either elected officials or state ballot measures. You can lobby the state regulatory process, for example, at the State Board of Education, or you can qualify an initiative for the statewide ballot. But the most common way to influence state level public policies is to move a proposal through the state legislature. And you can do that by means of a couple processes. One, the policy bill process, and two, the budget process, or these two processes combined. What we're focusing on today is the budget process. Well, one key thing to understand about the budget process is that it's different from the policy bill process. The budget process, for example, is a process that, for example, a policy bill might require schools to start and end the school day at a specific time. Or a policy bill could devote time in the school day for professional development for teachers and other school staff. Whereas the budget process is used to provide the dollars to implement the policies that are in other places of legislation. Now, another thing to understand about the California budget is that it's not one piece of legislation or one bill, but in fact is actually a package of bills. So when we look at that package, the first piece of a budget is an actual budget bill, which is the foundation of the budget package. A budget bill provides departments with authority to spend money across an array of services in a single year. It moves through budget committees, not policy committees, on a distinct timeline. And there can be, and typically are, more than one budget bill in an annual budget cycle. Now, the rest of the budget is budget-related trailer bills. These trailer bills generally move in tandem with the budget bill, but can move independently, including through the legislature's policy bill process. Generally, trailer bills make policy and statutory changes needed to implement policy changes assumed in the budget bill. There's no limit on the number of trailer bills that may be included in a budget package. Now, there are reasons why one would want to have issues addressed in either a budget bill or budget bill language, as opposed to trailer bill or trailer bill language. Budget bill language goes directly into a budget bill and is effective for only 1 year. That is, it's a temporary change. Advocates may prefer budget bill language because if the change in the budget is seen as negative, it automatically expires at the end of a fiscal year. The governor may also prefer issues dealt with through budget bill language because the governor has more control over that budget bill language and can delete specific provisions in a budget bill. But the governor cannot do the same with regard to trailer bills, for which the governor has to accept or reject the entire bill. On the other hand, if the change is in trailer bill language, then it would remain in effect until lawmakers or the governor subsequently change state law. So if you're making a proposal that you want to exist for more than 1 year, you would want it included in trailer bill language instead of in budget bill language. For example, Governor Brown in 2012-13 proposed and put the local control funding formula in a budget trailer bill. Funding for the local control funding formula is in budget bill language. Now that I've given you some basic understanding about what a budget is, let's talk a little bit about the budget process. California's Constitution establishes the basic rules of the state budget process. And one thing to understand about the California Constitution is that it's quite long and very complicated. In fact, it's roughly 10 times as long as the US Constitution, and it's been amended about 20 times as often. I'll be talking to you about some of those constitutional amendments in just a moment. But first, let's talk about some constitutionally set budget-related deadlines. The first deadline in the Constitution is that by January 10th of each year, the governor must propose a budget to the legislature, and the budget must be balanced. That is, its estimated revenues, as determined by the governor, must meet or exceed the governor's proposed spending. Now, the legislature also has a constitutional deadline of June 15th. The legislature must pass a budget bill, but notably not a trailer bill or trailer bills, by midnight on June 15th, and that budget also must be balanced. That is, estimated general fund revenues as set forth in the budget bill must meet or exceed general fund spending. Now, the budget bill and most budget-related trailer bills can now be passed by a simple majority. However, it didn't used to be that way, and that's because a constitutional amendment was passed by state voters when they approved Proposition 25 in 2010. Proposition 25 was a sea change in how the state does its budgeting. Before Prop 25, a 2/3 vote was needed to pass budget bills and budget-related trailer bills that were intended to take effect immediately. Now, this resulted in many late budgets. For those that were around in the late aughts, you might remember that budgets oftentimes weren't passed until the late summer and sometimes even into the early fall. So this constitutional amendment allowed for the legislature to pass budgets more readily. Now, the Constitution also contains complex formulas that establish state budget priorities. State policymakers don't start from scratch when they establish a state budget. The Constitution outlines some key priorities on how a large share of the dollars that flow through the state budget should be allocated. I'm just going to give you two examples here. First, Proposition 98, that was voted into the state constitution by voters in 1988, guarantees a minimum level of funding for K-12 schools and community colleges. Now, that constitutional amendment, at the time it was passed, was seen as a way of creating a floor for funding for schools and community colleges. However, more often than not, it serves as a ceiling for the funding for K-12 schools and community colleges. Another constitutional amendment, Proposition 2, was approved by voters in 2014, better known as the state's rainy day fund. It requires some of state revenues each year to be set aside to pay down debts and save for a rainy day. So these are just two examples of formulas in the state constitution that really set what are the budget allocations for a given annual budget cycle. Okay, now that I've talked to you a little bit as well about the state budget process and what is a state budget, let's talk about the key players in that process. The key three players, or the three entities that are the players in the budget process, are the governor, the legislature, and the public. As you probably know, Governor Gavin Newsom was elected governor in November of 2018. The legislature is led by Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins, and the assembly is led by Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon. And then the public also plays a key role in the budget process. However, one thing you should understand about the California state budget is that it is a very executive-centered budget process that vests great authority and power in the governor's hands, as well as the governor's Department of Finance. The Department of Finance has a large staff with responsibility of crafting the governor's annual budget. And the Department of Finance does the technical work behind the governor's proposals. Now, the governor proposes a budget each January, as I mentioned, and allows the governor to set sort of the stage or frame the discussion around a budget and a budget cycle. The governor also releases a revision of that budget proposal in May. That gives the governor yet another chance to frame the discussion about the budget. And in addition, the governor can veto bills in the budget package or veto all or individual appropriations. And it gives the governor great authority that veto authority gives the governor great control over what exactly is in a state budget, because it's difficult to override a veto. It takes 2/3 of both houses of the legislature. Now, the legislature also has a key role in crafting the annual budget. It reviews and revises the governor's proposal, and it also has the help of its own office called the Legislative Analyst Office, which helps it with its budget proposals. Now, the legislature primarily reviews and revises the governor's proposals through its two budget committees and their subcommittees. The two budget committees are led by Senator Holly Mitchell and by Assembly Member Phil Ting. There are 6 budget subcommittees in the Assembly and 5 in the Senate that hold dozens of hearings to consider the governor's proposals and air alternatives. The Legislative Analyst is led by Gabriel Pettick, and they provide fiscal and policy advice to the legislature, participating in the hearings I just mentioned and weighing in on the governor's proposals. Now, in general, the legislature approves, rejects, or modifies the governor's proposals and can substantially revise the budget by adding new spending or new programs. They use the governor's proposal as the basis for developing their own budget priorities and advancing their own policy initiatives prior to negotiating a final deal with the governor. Now, the public also has an important role to play in the budget process and can make their voices heard in various ways. For example, the public can write letters or send emails to the administration or to legislators. It can rally at the state capitol, and it can also testify at hearings. Now, a key role that's not pictured here on this slide is meeting with state legislators along with officials in the governor's administration. This last role points to the importance of building relationships with key players in the budget process. If there's one thing I leave with you today, I think the most important message is that relationships really matter. developing connections with key members of the legislature's budget subcommittees and staff of the Department of Finance are very, very important in terms of having an influence over the budget process. Who are the members of those committees? Well, the key members as relates to education decisions in the budget are in the budget subcommittees on the Assembly and Senate side that focus on education issues. On the Assembly side, the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 2 focuses on education finance, and on the Senate side, Senate Budget Subcommittee number 1 focuses on education issues as well. We've listed here the members of those committees as well as also the chairs of those committees. The Department of Finance also plays a key role in developing budget priorities. The Department of Finance has an education systems staff that is led by Jeff Bell, the program budget manager, as well as also assistant program budget managers that have responsibility for specific areas of crafting the state budget. There are also other staffers underneath the assistant program budget managers. Now, another key thing to understand is that numbers matter when you're trying to influence state budget policy. Working with allies and in coalitions can increase your influence. And the good news is that education advocates have many, many potential allies. For example, have many potential allies. For example, there are parent-teacher associations, education labor organizations, and numerous education advocacy organizations that can be seen as allies with regard to potential budget priorities that you may have. All right, now that I've talked about the key players in the budget process, I'm going to move on to the timeline and how it is that the budget process actually goes from year to year. The most important thing to understand about the timeline is that the budget process is cyclical. There is no clear start and stop date to an actual budget process. And another way of really putting it is that there's really no off season for the budget. Everyone year round is looking at different ways that they can influence what's happening in the budget process. Now, I'm going to be talking to you, that said, about sort of 3 distinct cycles or periods that we've broken down the budget process into for purposes of illustrating ways that what actually happens during the budget cycle, as well as also ways that the public can engage. And what's going to be showing to you in these next slides are arrows. Those arrows will be pointing to way the public can actually engage in the budget process. So let's first look at the July to December period. In this period, the governor's administration and the Department of Finance is leading the development of a proposed budget. On the legislative side, leaders are developing their budget priorities, and budget committee staff are looking ahead to upcoming budget deliberations. Now, the public has several opportunities here to engage in the budget process in this way. First, this is a good time in the year for you to be establishing relationships with members of both the administration and the legislative branch. The reason is it's slightly less busy during this period of time, and people will have more time to listen and hear what it is that you are thinking about. Now, one of the key ways to get your budget priority considered is to try to get that priority actually included in the governor's budget proposal. So, in terms of how to engage with the governor's administration, this would be a good opportunity to engage with administration officials, people in the Department of Finance, to have your priorities considered. Similarly, you can look to legislative leaders to champion your budget priorities, and you can seek to have budget committees and the subcommittees of the budget committees consider your budget priorities as part of what you will focus on in part of their upcoming budget hearings. Now, the January to mid-May period is a very active period in terms of the budget cycle. It is led at first by the governor's administration proposing a budget by January 10th. Now, in this period as well, after January 10th, the Department of Finance is making adjustments to that initial proposal and preparing for the May revision. On the legislative side, budget subcommittees, of which I mentioned earlier, are holding hearings to review the budget proposal. Now, the public can engage here by importantly paying attention to what is actually in the governor's proposal. This is a key way to engage in the budget process. And what is important is making sure that the administration and legislative leaders understand what your opinions are about what is in or maybe not in the governor's proposals, to provide candid feedback to both the legislature as well as also the governor on what is actually in the January 10th budget proposal. On the legislative side, the public can testify at the hearings on the budget issues that you care about, as well as meet with legislators and their staff about the budget issues that are of importance to you. In the mid-May to June period, this is the period that is most busy and probably the most difficult to actually establish meetings with members of the legislature and the administration, because it's a tight timeline. And if you haven't established relationships up until this point, it's going to be more difficult for you to gain an audience with either the administration or with the legislature. In this period, the May revision is released by May 14th. This is the revision to the governor's initial budget proposal in January. And on the legislative side, budget subcommittees are convening hearings on that proposal, and the Budget Conference Committee is established. That is, representatives from both the Assembly and the Senate are put on the Budget Conference Committee to iron out differences between those two houses, and ultimately to then allow for the legislative leaders to meet with the governor, that is the big three, to negotiate the final outlines of a budget package. The public has opportunities here as well to engage with administration officials about what is in the May proposal, as well as also testifying at the hearings and meeting with key legislators and staff during the Budget Subcommittee and Budget Conference Committee process. Now, one thing to understand here, this May 14th proposal is taking into account the final tax receipts that the government understands it will have, and then is allowed to actually craft a final budget once June 15th budget bill deadline arrives, and then there is an actual budget package that is negotiated. Now, I've thrown a lot of information at you in a short period of time, and we do not expect that you can internalize all that information, but here are some more budget resources, and I'll remind you that these slides and this presentation will be up on our website after today's presentation. But a few resources that I'll point out to you. First, the Budget Center does more than presentations such as this, but also provides analysis and commentary on what's going on with the budget throughout the budget cycle. We also provide technical assistance, and you can reach out to me or to other members of the Budget Center who can actually help you with any individual questions and asks you might have. The Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office both have important websites that include important information that you can use. For example, on the Department of Finance website, the governor's budget proposals and related documents are included, and in the Legislative Analyst Office, budget and policy analyses are produced throughout the year, and budget recommendations and historical budget data are also included. A few other places that you can look to for budget information are the Legislative Counsel's Office, which publishes bills as well as bill analyses, as well as also includes a free bill tracking service and state law, better known as state codes, and the state constitution. The State Assembly and the State Senate both have websites that include important information about committee schedules that I mentioned to you during the presentation today, as well as also committee agendas that tell you when it is that particular areas of the state budget will be heard in the budget subcommittees. There's also the annual legislative calendar and, importantly, live audio streaming of legislative proceedings on both of those websites. So I encourage you to be in touch with the Budget Center. My email address is here and will be up later, as well as also to follow us on Twitter. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this back to Sarah, and we'll have the rest of today's presentations.
Thank you, Jonathan. And as Jonathan mentioned, and another reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days, as well as the presentation slides. And with that, we want to turn it over to our next presenter. Martha Zaragoza Diaz is a lobbyist with Zaragoza, Diaz and Associates. And Martha is here to share the important role that she's played in helping to engage community members and coalitions in the state budget process, and how that's played out with many important issues pertaining to the education community. Martha?
Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan stated, the establishment of educational policy can be done through either a policy bill or through the budget. That's why it is very important for advocates to understand how the budget process works in order to help shape educational policy. This is an opportunity for advocates and the public to comment on the proposed governor's state budget and to determine which of the proposals they will support, they will oppose, they will revise, or perhaps insert a budget issue of importance to them. As an example, the need for increased number of bilingual teachers was clearly identified by parents, teachers, district and school superintendents, and other statewide advocacy organizations. The unavailability of bilingual teachers hampered the ability for communities and schools to establish either new bilingual programs or expand existing ones. This need was brought to the attention of the Californians Together Coalition and also the California Association for Bilingual Education. As a result, addressing the bilingual teacher shortage became a priority of these two organizations. A decision was made to pursue a bill and also to pursue funding through the budget process in order to address this bilingual teacher shortage. Please note that the legislative and budget processes happen simultaneously. They occur in tandem. This is important to remember because one needs to be very clear and knowledgeable about when budget committees and budget subcommittees will meet and hear specific budget proposals that they're looking at. So it's important also to know what information is contained in the governor's proposed state budget. Is your budget issue and or funding request included in the budget? If not, then where should it fit? As an example, again, with regards to the bilingual teacher shortage, in the year 2017-18, the governor and the legislature addressed as a priority in the budget how to increase the number of teachers, especially teachers for science, math, and special education. Nowhere was mentioned the need for bilingual teachers. Therefore, this was an opportunity for us, the Californians Together and CABE, to insert this budget issue and funding request in the state budget. So one of the first steps is to make sure that your budget issue or budget funding request is included in a subcommittee agenda, the budget subcommittee agenda. Remember, the budget subcommittees have several roles. One is to provide information to their members as to the specific governor proposals and the state budget and the proposed state budget. The other role is that they provide recommendations or direction in which the subcommittee should go on specific governor budget proposals. And they also, most importantly, provide recommendations to the full budget committee as to which budget items should be included in the full budget. So therefore, it's really, really important that your budget issue and or budget fund request is included in the agenda of the budget subcommittee. The members, when I approached the budget subcommittees of both houses with regards to the need for funding for bilingual teachers, they did not know that this was an issue, that this was a problem. So again, utilizing the budget process was very important on this budget issue. After these budget subcommittees forward their recommendations to the full budget committee of both houses, the Assembly Budget Subcommittee submits its recommendations of budget items to be included to the Assembly full budget, and the same goes for the Senate. Then the full budget committee discusses it, reviews it, makes any changes, and then they approve the budget bill, budget package, and that gets sent to the floor of the respective houses. After the Assembly and the Senate also reviews the budget, and determines what should stay in, what should stay out. Then that bill, the budget bill goes before the two-house budget conference committee. The budget conference committee is then responsible to reconcile the differences of the versions of the governor's budget, the Senate budget, and the Assembly budget. I'm raising this because, again, it is very important to monitor when the budget bill is presented on the floor, when the budget bill is presented before the conference committee, that we monitor monitor our budget request or budget issues to make sure that it continues to stay in the budget package. When the floors of the houses, the Senate or the Assembly, approves the final budget, it then goes to the governor's office. And then again, we must monitor our budget request and funding an issue to make sure that it continues to stay in the budget package. There are other important points that you must remember in order to work the budget process effectively. The first one is timing. Timing is very important in order to determine when to push on your for your budget request. You must do your homework. You must understand the budget issue that you are pursuing and the budget fund request that you are seeking. You must substantiate your budget issue and or budget fund request either with data or with research. In the case of the Bilingual Teacher Professional Development Program, the bilingual teacher shortage was confirmed by a report that was written by Californians Together. This helped substantiate our request for funding for addressing the bilingual teacher shortage. I don't know if you know, but the Center for Budget and Policy recently released a report on the bilingual teacher shortage as well, and you may want to take a look at that. As Jonathan stated, relationships matter. This is very, very important. And relationships are developed over time. They just don't happen overnight. Honesty, integrity, and accuracy of information is necessary in establishing and maintaining relationships. Identifying key members, legislative members of the budget committees and subcommittees and conference committee, as well as key budget staff and legislative staff is necessary in order to obtain recognition of your budget issue or budget fund request, and in order to get support of either one of those. Communication is critical. Determine your campaign strategies with regards to how to approach the legislators, the governor, and other supporters for your budget issue or budget fund request. Identify who to target, when, and how. Any written information and leave behind materials must be specific, concise, and accurate. Most importantly, effective testimony is essential. Who shall provide testimony is important and may decide how members of your budget subcommittee will vote on your budget issue and or budget fund request. Determine if it should be a constituent, a parent, a student, a teacher, or a district or school superintendent. It could be all of these, but at different points in the budget process. Jonathan also mentioned that numbers matter. Numbers do matter. I can't emphasize this enough. Legislators must see, hear, and feel the importance of your budget issue and or your budget fund request. Develop a strategy to obtain as many legislators' support, to gain governor support, and to obtain community and other stakeholder support. Work in coalitions, utilize social media. 100 or more calls, letters, emails are more effective than 5 or 10. Work both houses in order to avoid having your budget request go to the Budget Conference Committee. Again, working the budget process takes time. If you don't succeed the first time, try again the following year. And lastly, the most important step in addition to securing funding is monitoring the implementation of whatever budget appropriation was approved. You need to inform the field and or community of the availability of these funds. You need to identify which state agency has the responsibility of administering the budget, appropriation that was approved. You need to know if it's a grant program, when the RFA will be released, when the RFA will need to be submitted. And this is important because we need to show that there has been good stewardship regarding the use of the approved budget funding. Also, most importantly, in the case of the Bilingual Teacher Professional Development Grant Program, the need exceeded the funding. We had probably 30 applications for only the ability of six of those applications to be funded. So this provides additional support and data to obtain additional funding for the next coming year. So thank you very much. I hope this was helpful in getting a better understanding of how the budget process works. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, for sharing. And again, a reminder that if you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat box and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Also a reminder that we are recording this, slides and the recording will be available on our website. And so we're happy to get to our final speaker for today. We have Lizzette or Barrios-Gracian joining us. She's a teacher at Anaheim High School. And Lizzette is going to share a little bit more with us about how the state budget process plays out on the local level and share how the Bilingual Teacher Professional Development Program has helped her and her students and why it's been so valuable, and also the importance of continued funding and support from state leaders and the community for programs like this one. So with that, I will turn it over to Lizzette. Thank you for joining us today.
So as it was said, my name is Lizzette Barrios-Gracian, and I'm teaching for the Dual Language Academy at Anaheim High School. Currently, I'm teaching 10th grade world history, a journalism program, which is bilingual. And I teach Spanish for Spanish speakers. And as you can see, I have very different areas that I'm teaching in. And this is due to the shortage of bilingual teachers. But today I'd like to start off with, I don't want to just talk to you as a teacher, but also as a former student of the California Public Education in English-only schools, and as a parent who has had the privilege of having 2 children in dual language programs. So I came to the United States at the age of 7 from Mexico, and I was enrolled at Woodcrest Elementary in Fullerton. At the time, Woodcrest Elementary allowed for students to have somewhat of a bilingual education. They would pull us out and give us an hour to continue our lessons in reading and writing in Spanish. And this was done as we were gaining proficiency in English. This worked out terrific for me as a student. I was able to feel comfortable. The anxiety of being a newcomer was completely gone. And I was able to be redesignated as an English student in only 2 years. I entered in 2nd grade, and by the time I was in 4th grade, I had been redesignated. In 5th grade, my family, because of money issues like most immigrants face, we moved to Anaheim. And ironically, in during that time at Anaheim Elementary, which is now making news across the state because all of its schools now have a bilingual program. Back then, though, it was English only. And for me, it was a shocking transition. I had been in an environment where my culture and my language was valued, and I went into an environment where, you know, we became accustomed to hearing "speak English, this is America." Completely different transition. I was very lucky that I didn't have the shame of being an English learner anymore. I didn't have to be pulled out to take those classes, but it left a lasting effect on me. I soon became ashamed of speaking Spanish, and I worked very hard to get rid of my accent in English, and it really left a long-lasting effect to the point where I majored in English in college. I became an English teacher, and I taught 9th and 10th grade English for 14 years. And though I am considered a success story, the reality is that for a very long time, I felt guilty about having turned away from my own culture, my language, and my history in order to fit in and climb up in our society. This is something that our students today in the dual language immersion will never have to experience. They have the joy of being valued as individuals, no matter what their first language. The first thing that I was taught when I was receiving my bilingual authorization was to value my students' language and forms of expression. You know, it was shocking to me the first time I heard that Spanglish was in fact okay, because it is showing how our students learn language and how they transition, and it's a path towards becoming or gaining that academic language. I am a product of Cal State's Fullerton's Bilingual Authorization Program, and also participated in the Become project after I received my bilingual authorization. Both programs helped me to gain the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence to teach in Spanish because it was something that I had lost. They also helped me grow in empathy, in helping me value each of my students for who they are. Again, because of the shortage in bilingual teachers, I saw the need, and I had to seek out a third credential in history. So I hold a credential in Spanish, English, and in history. And this was in order for our program to succeed and grow as we saw more students coming into Anaheim High School requesting to be part of the dual language. The Become project was especially helpful to me after receiving my bilingual authorization because it helped me build a network of teachers. There's very few of us at the high school level teaching bilingual education. And so there's very few people that you can turn to and check or learn from to make sure that, you are growing as a teacher. Project Become was especially unique in the fact that they involved administrators in the districts and also instructional assistants to attend. And this was a 6-month program that we attended once a month during the weekends. And administrators were able to see the needs that bilingual teachers had and how to better support us. They became aware of the fact that getting textbooks, finding materials is extremely complicated and sometimes non-existent. And we have to go ahead and create all of that. Our instructional assistants learned how to work one-on-one with our students in a group setting. And they also learn how to become that that support that we need for each lesson. And so that really created a space where our students had complete support and understanding from everyone involved in our school. And everybody understood how a bilingual education classroom should look and what they should have. And our school is working on that, and our district is working on that, thanks to the Become Project. More than that, we were able to create a network through neighboring cities and our state that as bilingual teachers we can turn to. We were able to share best practices, create lessons, and received materials that were so necessary in our classrooms. At Anaheim High School, we have had the Dual Language Academy for the past 7 years. Our students started at elementary school. They continued to Sycamore Junior High, which also we're very proud of, about the fact that we have 2 junior highs that have the Dual Language Academy in Spanish, and 2 high schools that provide the Dual Language Academy in Spanish. And we just recently this year we started the Vietnamese Learning Dual Language Academy at Magnolia High School. So we're very excited about the numbers of teachers that are enrolling in single credential programs who are also seeking out the bilingual authorization, because our goal is to create biliteracy, meaning that students should gain the academic language needed in content areas. They should be familiar with the terminology used in mathematics, literature, history, science, etc. In the 7 years, we have seen the success that dual language immersion provides for our students. We have a cohort of about 40 students a year and we're soon going to see that increase because more elementary schools have a dual language academy now. And so from our cohorts, we have 100% high school graduation rate, with 100% acceptance to Cal State universities and UCs. Our students who are currently attending community college is due to the fact of for financial reasons, not because they lack the ability, but because they chose to begin at a community college because of financial reasons. It just made more sense for them to do so. But we're very proud of our acceptance rates at Cal State and UCs when it comes to our bilingual students. All our students graduate with a seal of biliteracy from California, and we have a 95% passing rate in AP Spanish language and AP Spanish literature exams. It is important to point out that in these numbers, we have students who entered the program being English-only speakers. Our students are not only heritage Spanish speakers. We also have Caucasian, African Americans, and Asian students who have enrolled in our programs from kindergarten and now are being extremely successful at the high school level. They are graduating as biliterate. Many will become multilingual because Spanish is their 3rd language. So that is something that has us very excited. This rate of success is only possible because the dual language immersion program excels in being inclusive. Our students feel valued and challenged. We have teachers that are constantly looking to better themselves. Our district is a great support in finding programs for us to grow in. And this is where money is an issue. We can't continue to grow as teachers if we don't have the budget to do so. As a result of becoming biliterate and bicultural, our students have developed a global mentality. Our students don't just want to be business majors. They are majoring in international business. They don't just study political science, they study foreign affairs. they don't dream of just being doctors. They want to be doctors for Doctors Without Borders. We are seeing a global mentality that is growing with every generation. We are, in fact, creating global citizens. My daughter graduated from our program last year. She's currently studying at Berkeley, majoring in theater and ethnic studies, and with the goal of being able to tell the stories or being inclusive in theater and being able to have programs that are not only in English, plays that include every single language. I'm proud of her ability to communicate academically in a professional manner in both language. It was something that I had to work in as an adult. I had lost most of my academic language in Spanish, and it was very hard to gain that back again. So I'm extremely proud of her ability to communicate in both languages and do it so wonderfully. I now have a younger daughter who's following in her footsteps and is also working into becoming biliterate. We need more bilingual teachers. We need materials. We have very few publishers that publish in Spanish, and therefore it is a challenge. But we are being successful. Our dual language immersion programs are creating problem solvers because their minds have developed the ability to see scenarios from different perspectives. They're not in a bubble, and they are able to see the reality, not the only reality that they're living, but the reality of others. They're curious about the world, and they're very motivated in creating cross-cultural experiences, relationships, and in solving the problems in our communities, as well as looking out into the world and seeing what is their spot in that world. How will they fit into tomorrow's world? And as we can see, we no longer live in a nation that is isolated. We have this need for these kids with a global mentality that are able to reach out and become the problem solvers of tomorrow. And we see companies that are hiring kids that are bilingual. Being monolingual is no longer a choice that our students have. It really will affect their future negatively if they're not able to speak more than one language. So I'm very excited to see our district grow. We now are offering Vietnamese, Spanish, and we're looking into offering Arabic and Korean in the near future. So I hope that gives you a small view from a teacher, a parent, and a student's perspective of what it's like to become a bilingual student. Thank you.
Lizzette, thank you so much for sharing your personal story, your professional story, and really the importance of engagement in the state budget process, engagement at the local level. I think you really brought that Jonathan's piece, Martha's piece all together for all of us. And with that,